This video will not have spoilers for either Donkey Kong Bonanza or Metroid Prime 4. Since Donkey Kong rocketed back into the big leagues with Donkey Kong Bonanza in 2025, a game piloted by a new splinter group of the 3D Mario team, a major question has become, what is the future of 2D Donkey Kong? The series has never found a steady footing in terms of developers. Rare shot the series to tremendous heights for 3 years in the late era of the Super NES. The 3D Mario team took a tilt with Jungle Beat, and in 2010 and 2014 Retro Studios briefly brought the country games back to huge acclaim. But more than a decade since the tropics first froze, 2D Donkey Kong has been stuck in a purgatory of ports and remasters. However, with evidence of a Donkey Kong movie in the works, the new Donkey Kong theme park push, and a massive game in Bonanza, a return to 2D for the superlative simian can't be very far away, surely. In this video, we're going to be looking at some credits detective work, analysing the context and the financial considerations, and looking at what the future for 2D Donkey Kong could really be. First of all then, I think we should really take a moment to consider the overall likelihood of 2D Donkey Kong returning at all. In a recent Ask the Developer interview concerning Donkey Kong Bonanza, Kenta Motakura explicitly name-checked 2D Donkey Kong. He said, "We thought that by creating something new, leveraging our experience developing 3D Mario games, we'd have the opportunity to create two separate branches, 2D Donkey Kong and 3D Donkey Kong, just as we did with Mario games." End quote. Now, this could be read different ways. My assumption is that it means that Nintendo, the company, has the opportunity for two separate branches, but I have seen an interpretation that he means that the two branches could be created by EPD8 themselves, which, after all, is the only group in existence still to have had experience of both 2D and 3D Donkey Kong. I'm less sure about this interpretation. Firstly, remember that Motakura is a senior producer, and while it's easily forgotten, Donkey Kong Bonanza was not the only Donkey Kong game to drop in 2025. Donkey Kong Country Returns HD also made its Switch debut in January of 2025, and it's quite plausible that this was the game that Motakura was referencing as to the 2D shot to Bonanza's 3D chaser. But what is the precedent for a single team handling both 2D and 3D entries in the same series? In 2002, the 3D Mario team didn't just hive itself off, but left Kyoto for the bright lights of Tokyo, and when 2D Mario returned, it was with Takashi Tezuka's team, which is now called EPD Group 10. There's no evidence of a wish to reunite the branches of Mario formally, but there is evidence of some greater cross-pollination. Koichi Hayashida, who was the long-term producer of 3D Mario games, seems to have crossed the floor to EPD10 at the end of the 2010s and has taken a big part in shaping Super Mario Bros. Wonder alongside Shinomori, who they poached from the 2D Zelda team. It should also be said that Mario has so many people working on games across the company, and many of the senior leaders have direct Mario experience. EPD's number 2, Koizumi, was a designer on the original Mario Kart and is credited on every 3D Mario title, including directing Sunshine and Galaxy. Therefore, it is less crucial for institutional knowledge of the Mario character to reside in a single studio. Zelda is a different matter. Eiji Aonuma has been responsible for all forms of Zelda, top-down, 3D and open air, for a very long time. However, even then, there were distinctive 2D teams that Aonuma referred to as late as the mid-2010s. Most of the senior 2D Zelda team, as was, either left Nintendo, left the 2D team, see the aforementioned Shinomori, or else was absorbed into the massive project that became Breath of the Wild in 2017. If you're interested in what happened to this group, I have a separate video that deep dives it. But since Triforce Heroes in 2015, Grezzo has increasingly been relied upon to develop top-down Zelda to the point where Grezzo's Satoshi Terada directed Echoes of Wisdom, and the team were heavily consulted on the overall design of the game. Then we have Metroid. Yoshio Sakamoto has confined himself almost exclusively to the 2D game development, with the exception of Other M, while Kensuke Tanabe has taken the lead on the Prime games. I would suggest in this case there's a reason for this divergence, which is that Prime was developed in America and Sakamoto doesn't speak fluent English, whereas Tanabe has been happy to serve as Nintendo's producer for many of the games developed at Retro, Next Level Games, and other Western studios over the years. There are obviously pros and cons to splitting a franchise up in this way. On the one hand, it makes the games more diverse and distinct from each other and allows the teams to cross-pollinate ideas by choice without ending up drawing from the same talent pool and the same set of ideas. On the other hand, especially with a smaller property, it could make the games feel rootless and lacking a coherent vision. However, there is a difficulty with the 2D Donkey Kong franchise. Kensuke Tanabe was a producer on Donkey Kong Country 3, having supported the original game and led it back in 2010 and 2014 with the Retro Studios titles. However, as he is 63 in 2026, the likelihood is that he will retire at some point in the coming years. At this point, Donkey Kong will need a new senior producer to shepherd it. The obvious person may be Tanabe's longtime number 2, Risa Tabata, who had her first producer credit on Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door in 2024, but her focus in recent times has tended to be as part of a broader group production department rather than as a creative lead and brand advocate like Eiko Goko of Animal Crossing or Eiji Aonuma of Zelda. Having someone else such as Kenta Motakura head Donkey Kong in its entirety from EPD8 would therefore make some sense, although notably, no reference was made to consulting Tanabe or anyone on the country games during the Ask the Developer interview for Bonanza. There's also EPD10, which generally has had nothing to do with Donkey Kong, though Koichi Hayashida was an assistant director on Jungle Beat and so does have some history with the franchise. Even if the producers are settled, the actual potential developers of the game are another matter. Even the Zelda group has rarely managed to produce both 2D and 3D games internally. But I think the key question we have to consider is, what kind of 2D Donkey Kong does Nintendo want? If they want Donkey Kong Country specifically, with that aesthetic and that distinctive and beloved tradition of more challenging and precise platforming action, it's one thing. If they want Donkey Kong to exist in 2D, then they have more scope. Just as Bonanza reinterpreted what Donkey Kong could be, Nintendo could do something quite distinctive, just as they did with the bongo mechanics in Jungle Beat. So which way will Nintendo go? I think the timing of Donkey Kong Country Returns' release may be telling here. Putting out a 2D game now satisfies demand for 2D Donkey Kong for a while at least, and this was the last of the Donkey Kong Country titles not to be available in some form on the Switch. The original trilogy are out on Nintendo Switch Online, and of course Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze made the system back in 2018. Putting this game out then was the final tour of duty for the Rare era look of Donkey Kong. On literally the same day as Donkey Kong Country Returns HD came out, Nintendo debuted the new look for Donkey Kong, subtly at first, as a quick glimpse in the background of the Mario Kart World teaser, and then of course the April Switch 2 Direct made the new look for Donkey Kong utterly unambiguous. And yet, the Rare look has hardly been abandoned. They've been launching Donkey Kong Country in a theme park area such as the one this May. In other words, they seem far from done with the Rare era presentation of the character, even as they are pivoting to a new look. I do think that Nintendo would be capable of pivoting to the new look Donkey Kong and casting the Rare version adrift if they so wished. And if this were another company, I'd expect them to do just that, to emphasize brand cohesion and harmony by presenting just one version of the character. However, Nintendo has shown themselves to be quite comfortable with a wide variety of different aesthetic variations for their core cast. As they brought Mario and Luigi onto HD consoles with Brothership, they could have chosen a different aesthetic, but it's still markedly different from any other Mario look. Same with Paper Mario, and I scarcely need to do more than say the word Zelda, and you will already be thinking of the many and varied, sometimes hugely different, takes on the look of that series. It's not a problem for Nintendo to have multiple versions of Donkey Kong, and it's not a problem for them to have a series that cleaves to different types of looks. If and when they do another Donkey Kong Country game, they may consider that this is just how Donkey Kong in country games looks, and that they should keep to this overall appearance for consistency. Even then, if they wanted to update the look, they could still do so while doing a country game, as ultimately it's a fairly subtle differentiation. So, does 2D Donkey Kong need to be a country game? Country games have majored on being challenging games for expert players, and that made sense in the dog days of the 16-bit era, where platformers were 10 a penny and grizzled veterans longed for something a bit harder edged. But Bonanza has explicitly tried to make Donkey Kong accessible again, and I'm not sure a challenging 2D variant necessarily has the same appeal to Nintendo. In fact, we can be fairly sure it doesn't because they made a new funky mode, the big appeal of the Switch edition in 2018. They could have gone for a challenge mode, but no, they focused on making it accessible, and I don't really blame them. Ditching the country moniker would give them a way to distance themselves from this reputation for challenging players, and of course there is a company with prior 2D Donkey Kong experience that is not in the country franchise. Donkey Kong Bonanza was not EPD8's first Donkey Kong rodeo, and of course, there have been persistent rumours for years about them taking on a 2D title, including hiring for 2D gameplay, although with Donkey Kong Bonanza and Super Mario Odyssey both having 2D sections, this doesn't necessarily mean a whole game in 2 dimensions. If Nintendo is serious about taking Donkey Kong back in-house again, the obvious thing would be to retire the country branding and do something quite different with the franchise. They have probably milked the country games for about as much profit on Switch as they can without significant more investment by doing fairly low-key versions of the 2 retro titles and slapping the SNES titles onto NSO. I'm grateful that they're available in hybrid form factor, but it was hardly a grand celebration of what they were and hardly suggested that they were looking to build on them in the future. In other words, while Nintendo does like to keep different versions of their core brands in play, they may feel like they've now squeezed every last drop of banana juice from Donkey Kong Country before they pivot to something brand new. Definitely, if they were going to draw a line under Donkey Kong Country, this is the way to do it, since the existing games will sell on Switch 2 for a long time to come and be part of the lineup without being a focus. They're not forgotten, but they will naturally recede into the background if and when newer 2D games appear. Let's think then which developers could take on the mantle of this 2D Donkey Kong. If we're thinking country, then there really is only one studio that feels obvious, and this is the group who developed the last 2 Donkey Kong countries, Retro Studios. Now, many people seem to think this is unlikely, and I've seen well-connected people from Kit Ellis of the Kid and Krista podcast and Reese Riley of Kiwi Talks both speculating that a return to the Donkey Kong country is unlikely from Retro. However, there's no indication that they have insider knowledge to this specific effect, even though clearly both have deep contacts and knowledge about Retro. They are speculating, and these things will have incredibly tight confidentiality arrangements drafted by a company which is motoring on surprise and delight. Plus, while Metroid news is ultimately unlikely to make a major financial impact, their Donkey Kong strategy has the potential to be hugely market sensitive, so all the more reason to make the news bubble completely impermeable if Nintendo can possibly avoid it. Therefore, I think we should review it from base principles. Firstly, we need to consider quite practically whether Retro even has the same people that worked on Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze still present. After all, if most of the key people have left, you become obligated to start again anyway. Now that we have the Metroid Prime 4 credits, the status of a lot of the Tropical Freeze developers all these years later is becoming a little clearer. Even though 49 Tropical Freeze staff were in the credits of Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, I said 48 in the previous video but I realised I missed someone, 13 were in the special thanks, suggesting that 12 years after the last country game, just 36 people remain. After adjusting for this, we can see that there are a few designers and artists, although this group has seen massive churn in recent years. Now, Nintendo has a great history of artists rising to lead game development. 3D Mario group leader Kenta Motakura, EPD's top 2 Shinya Takahashi and Yoshiaki Koizumi, and the inimitable Shigeru Miyamoto himself all had artistic backgrounds. Nevertheless, the experience that Nintendo may most wish to capture is of the gameplay design. Now, while the creative director Vince Jolly left the company in 2019, the senior designers of Tropical Freeze, Russell O'Henley and Bill Vandervoort, are still at the company in top positions. The game had 9 other design credits and 3 contract designers, of whom 7 returned for Metroid Prime 4, not as a special thanks. This is important because it shows that the company still has institutional memory of how to design a top-tier country game from this group of people. There are a few other designers and artists, but the group that has shown the most consistency is actually the engineering team. One person returned as a contract engineer, having been on the core staff of Tropical Freeze, and some of these senior people are special thanks credits on Beyond, but out of 20 core staff members in the Tropical Freeze engineering team, 12 were still on board for Metroid Prime 4. I would suggest that this is a solid core of people around whom to build a new Donkey Kong Country team if Nintendo wished. Doing so would certainly save them an awful lot of bother booting up a completely new group with no Donkey Kong Country experience. We also know that Retro have finally finished Metroid Prime 4, so presumably we'll have a new project in the works. As for Nintendo, the magic date is probably 2028 or 2029. If a Donkey Kong movie is to follow, the track record, admittedly of just one film, suggests that they will want to sell existing Donkey Kong games prior and then have a big new reveal for the Christmas after to ride the hype cycle. It's far too soon for another 3D game, so 2D it is. Zelda is scheduled for 2027 and 2030, and Nintendo would probably prefer to space out their film releases, so 2028 or 2029 would make the most sense. That would be a 3 or 4 year dev cycle, assuming they're starting now. We know that Retro are available for this, and the timings match up perfectly. In 2017, they tried to give Metroid Prime 4 to a different group, and it backfired. Would they really want to make the same mistake potentially with Donkey Kong now? Well, it depends on what Retro are doing next, of course. I've speculated before on them potentially taking on Metroid Prime 2 Remastered as an interim project while developing a full Metroid Prime 5. But as long as Prime continues to be as low selling as it is, there's always a question of how far Nintendo will want to keep pushing that franchise. It often has one game per system as well. Does it really need another game that will possibly not do any better than Metroid Prime 4 within the same generation? Now, I'm not sure the outlook is as bleak as all that for Metroid, but that's a topic that I will be covering in another video soon. For now, though, it's certainly true that even without a Donkey Kong film hoving into view, Donkey Kong Country would almost certainly be a more profitable venture for the company than another Metroid Prime title, especially a remake of one of the series' more divisive offerings. However, Nintendo is making enough money that it doesn't need to be driven by these kinds of short-term financial considerations necessarily. If the bet is on Metroid becoming a huge success in a 10 to 20 year window through a film project, there's no point in complicating matters by giving the potentially very successful Donkey Kong IP to a studio which has its attention already split. We should also consider that Retro had a long time without a game in development, and during this time we know that Nintendo had been noodling ideas for Donkey Kong's future. They knew since at least 2020 that he was going to be the major focus of a new game, star in a new movie, and be a major theme park attraction. This is more than enough time for the top people there to be noodling around ideas for a sixth mainline country excursion that might be prototyped while Metroid Prime 4 was in its final stages of testing. If we assume that Metroid Prime 2 Remastered is a thing, but that it's primarily going to be handled by Iron Galaxy, who contributed a lot to the original Remastered, and if we assume that Nintendo would like a Metroid Prime 5, but would like to take time to get it right, especially after the cooler than usual reception of Beyond, having Retro pivot to Donkey Kong for a few years while Metroid Prime 5 is finalized could make a lot of sense. Consider also that Nintendo are extremely reluctant to take their key franchises away from partnerships that are working, and they very seldom do. Even when Mario and Luigi landed at Acquire as a result of Alpha Dream going under, a handful of the senior developers carried over, while with the move from Mario Party from Hudson Soft to what was then ND Cube, also you saw a much greater consistency at the top, with many of the same developers actually being in place at ND Cube. It's true that Nintendo has wound back partnerships that weren't working for them. Clearly, Koei Tecmo's Team Ninja grouping didn't set the world on fire with Metroid Other M, but then no further Other M has been commissioned either. And when getting new teams up to speed with existing franchises, it's been a torturously slow process in the past. I've mentioned Grezzo, but while they started developing Zelda titles with Ocarina of Time 3D, released in 2011, and while they did have a kind of Zelda spin-off with 2015's Triforce Heroes, their first mainline Zelda was 2024's Echoes of Wisdom, after more than a decade of working together on ports and remakes. Mercury Steam got to be more innovative from the off, with Samus Returns in 2017 expanding significantly on the original before they were trusted with the fully original Metroid Dread, and Mages trod the same path with the Famicom Detective Club remakes and then an original game to follow. Indeed, I rather wonder whether this caution is actually a result of the Metroid Prime debacle, with the original developers of Metroid Prime 4 not working out. Nintendo is so much about learning by feel and sense rather than a manual. They really embody that Kyoto spirit of craftsmanship and wisdom being handed down from the wise forebears in the industry. Skipping this step with Metroid Prime 4 clearly ended badly, and it makes sense that remaking, or at least remastering, some of the best of the old games would be an excellent way to bring developers up to speed with what made those titles tick. It's been strongly suggested that Retro's work on remastering Metroid Prime was significantly responsible for the decision to bring them back to Metroid Prime for Metroid Prime 4. All things considered, I think there are strong reasons both for and against Retro. I certainly think they seem to be underestimated as potential Kong Kings in current discourse though, but that's not to say that they're going to be top bananas either. Let's consider then the alternatives, which broadly break down into two categories. One will be a Japanese studio, bringing the Great Ape back to the core team of developers, much as they did with Bonanza in 2025. Two would be another Western studio, given that country has multiple times found success and acclaim and a fair degree of popularity in Western hands. In Japanese terms, there are only really two likely existing groups internally. One is EPD10, the team behind Mario Maker, 2D Mario and Pikmin. Now, it's true that they have been able to expand their development efforts with the help of 18 on Pikmin, and it's possibly true that they have more development scope given the only modest success of Mario Maker 2, though it did nearly break 10 million, and for all we know, given the rate at which Nintendo releases information, may have done so by now. If they alternate between Super Mario Bros. And Donkey Kong instead of Mario Maker, it would make some sense. But I just don't find it hugely plausible. There's hardly any link between the development staffs, and while Takashi Tezuka once noted that the graphics of Donkey Kong Country Returns were an impetus to up their game for new Super Mario Bros. Wii, that's hardly suggestive of any deep involvement in the franchise. Just because they're in the 2D space, it doesn't feel to me like there's an obvious route to take on the franchise, and if anything, with Yoshi, 2D Mario, Mario Maker and Pikmin, plus ancillary projects like Princess Peach Showtime, which they also shepherd, the team already has quite a lot in their warp pipeline. Another option is EPD8 themselves. Now, I do think there's a decent chance that the central coordination of Donkey Kong in 2D reverts to EPD8 once Tanabe steps back, because after all, it would bring some coherence to the franchise. In 2010, when Retro stepped away from Metroid, Sakamoto's 2D group put up their 3D project. EPD8 also has a precedent of working with American developers, not Retro though, but rather Nintendo Software Technology, with whom they produced Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, the Switch Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, and the recent Galaxy 1+2 ports. What I can't really see though is an internal team at EPD8 taking on 2D Donkey Kong. It's not impossible, of course, but think through the logistics. The Odyssey team had to hire in a completely different group to take Bonanza to the finish line, and had to farm out finishing Bowser's Fury to Nintendo Software Technology, presumably so they could work on the major new Mario game. If Donkey Kong has a movie in the next few years, there's every chance of a sequel in the years that follow. With Donkey Kong Bonanza taking 5 years to develop under the new director Kazuya Takahashi, even after EPD8 had gone a long way with a Switch version in 2019, it makes sense that a Bonanza sequel might target 2031 or 2032, which, you will note, is 3 years after my suggested window for a Donkey Kong movie, or the ideal window for a Donkey Kong sequel film. Yes, it may seem crazy to think about scheduling games for a sequel to a film that has yet to be formally announced, still yet dated, but if Nintendo is to make the best fist of syncing its media with games, given the long development times of modern games, this is how they will need to be thinking. Under these circumstances, when is this group meant to develop a 2D game? Yes, they could split down again, and of course, as I've covered elsewhere, this process of progressive subdivision we know today out of the ashes of Miyamoto's old R&D Group 4 in the 80s, but there's a risk of splitting too far and too fast and spreading the group too thin. Therefore, while I think EPD8 may be a supervisory presence, they will be looking for an external partner that can handle the heavy lifting. Of course, all this changes if we assume that Tanabe handles the next Donkey Kong, and the 2D Donkey Kong after that is due, one would assume, around 2034. By this time, the Donkey Kong team will be long established and perhaps better able to do something imaginative and different with Donkey Kong in 2 dimensions. Of course, we're assuming that Nintendo will pivot to an original 2D game, and after 11 fallow years for 2D Donkey Kong, we surely hope, but there is another option which wouldn't involve creating a new game from the ground up. Jungle Beat was released in 2004. It hasn't been confirmed for GameCube or Nintendo Classics. Nintendo Software Technology have a lot of experience now remastering old EPD8 titles, and there's no EPD8 title older than their very first game. If the team didn't do a whole new game, but did stitch on some kind of extra mode, they might be able to broaden out the cast a little, perhaps focusing on Cranky, Dixie, King K. Rool, or even Pauline. Donkey Kong Jungle Beat plus Cranky's Fury would also be something smaller that could reasonably be guaranteed to target the release window of a film without Metroid Prime 4 style setbacks. The fact is, Nintendo may well want to do something similar with this game anyway as a matter of contingency planning. It never hurts to have something Donkey Kongish up their sleeve, given the vagaries of game production and the risks of things falling through. We have seen some precedent of them doing this kind of backup plan before, if we think back to New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe being available just after the end of 2018, which of course had the touch-and-go release of Super Smash Bros. In December. What if Nintendo commissions, therefore, not one but two different 2D Donkey Kong games? They have Jungle Beat from Nintendo Software Technology, with EPD8's newly formed Donkey Kong team helping to keep a watching brief, but not too involved because the majority of the game is already pinned down. Meanwhile, Tanabe makes one last journey to the Donkey Kong country. This would mean potentially 3 Switch 2 Donkey Kong titles in the machine's first 4 or 5 years, each a little distinct from the other, plus past games like Returns, Tropical Freeze, and the Mario vs. Donkey Kong titles as well. Nintendo would be very well positioned to take advantage of the hype window of the film under such circumstances. But if Tanabe is taking charge, who would he work with? Almost certainly an existing contact of his, and almost certainly, therefore, a Western group. And I will say I think there's also good scope for him to leverage his Paper Mario contacts at Intelligent Systems and his familiarity with the Country series to do a Donkey Kong-themed RPG as well, but that's a separate matter. Really, there's only Retro Studios and one other choice, his longtime collaborators on Luigi's Mansion, Federation Force, and more, Next Level Games. This does make more sense in some respects. Next Level Games has great skill with character animation, and when Nintendo took them over, they explicitly planned to expand them to allow them to increase their game's output. Metroid Prime 4 shows that there's at least some small degree of cross-pollination between the studios in these days, where video conferencing is easier than ever. Being in a different English-speaking nation is probably a manageable problem. However, they have already had Luigi's Mansion, and they have traditionally alternated between this and multiplayer titles. Yes, they're expanding massively with an explicit aim to increase their development capacity, but I think the immediate concern for Nintendo must be a new Luigi's Mansion. Remember, Luigi's Mansion 3 sold more than Splatoon 2. If it weren't part of the broader Mario franchise, it would be one of Nintendo's biggest properties in its own right. Like Donkey Kong, it's almost certainly going to be a film before too long, and quite likely within this generation. Now, Next Level Games have always enjoyed doing competitive multiplayer games as well, and I don't see the multiplayer side of things being any less of a concern for Nintendo in the era of game chat. Granted, these Next Level Games titles haven't always been as celebrated as Luigi's Mansion. Scarescraper didn't make much of a splash. Battle League wasn't enormously well received by the standards of previous Strikers games, and Federation Force wasn't the biggest hit. Even if Nintendo commissions another Strikers title, it'll be years away since Battle League was relatively recent. Next Level Games could go back and do something multiplayer themed around Punch-Out, but it feels to me like there's a good chance they might need to do something new. Now, Nintendo will need to expand its remit of Mario sports games. Mario Baseball was always a Bandai Namco deal, but they're tied up with Sakurai at present, and so the series skipped the Switch. Then again, they reportedly pitched a hockey-style game before, and if they ever wanted to do an ice hockey version of Mario, who better than Canada's own Next Level Games? I could absolutely see Next Level Games, though, working on a Donkey Kong of some description, but I don't necessarily think a 2D platformer is the most likely. If anything, something Kongish in the racing vein would make a lot more sense from them, or even a completely new kind of multiplayer experience where you compete on bongos or something similarly wacky. Donkey Kong has a great history with racing titles, with not just the near-legendary Diddy Kong Racing, but the sadly aborted, rare project Donkey Kong Racing. Given Next Level Games' passion for multiplayer gaming, they would make a far better fit for this than a 2D platformer, something they've never had any track record or apparent interest in doing. Then there's the option of a different collaboration partner entirely. WayForward have platforming experience and animation skill, but Advance Wars 1 Plus 2 Reboot Camp seemed to have some turbulence, and the same director released a non-Nintendo project in 2024. Goodfeel have their current hands full, including potentially working on the new Yoshi title. 18 have action and current Nintendo experience, but they might need a lot more guidance, and Nintendo is also looking to make sure Pikmin keeps going, and 18 also handle Pikmin to a large degree for EPD10. Could Mercury Steam follow in the footsteps of Retro and pivot from Metroid to Donkey Kong? It hardly seems like their aesthetic. While cumulatively I think there's a decent case that the next 2D Donkey Kong Country could be another studio besides Retro, I can't think of any specific single studio which seems more likely than Retro. Occam's razor alone makes me think that if they have the experience of delivering top-tier country games, perhaps it's time for them to have another shot. It may also make sense for this to be Tanabe's last rodeo as he approaches that magical age of 65, where a lot of people will retire in Japan. That said, I do expect to ultimately see an EPD8 link, and here I think we should just look at the coordinators from Tropical Freeze. Now granted, some of them are just general Nintendo production types who work on many games. A number seem to have either retired or been promoted out of getting day-to-day credits, but I find it curious that Toshihiko Okamoto, who was a level designer on Super Mario Odyssey and Donkey Kong Bonanza, was also one of the people supporting Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze's design. Okamoto was a coordinator before he worked in level design, and he did extensive work with the Western studios on the first two Strikers titles on Metroid Prime 3, Metroid Prime Hunters, and Punch-Out! In other words, with all three of Nintendo's North American studios. If you wanted someone who had built bridges with Next Level Games and Retro Studios, but who is also immersed in Donkey Kong with EPD8, who has experience as a coordinator and of in-depth level design. In other words, if you wanted somebody who could be the kind of figure that Aonuma is for Zelda or Nagami is for Splatoon, Okamoto might be a decent choice. One game working with Tanabe for a handover, and perhaps by this point we get into the surely inevitable Nintendo restructuring for when they move buildings, at which point I think it is very likely that we will get new groups formed and therefore a new Donkey Kong focused group. In terms of seniority, Okamoto ranks 4th out of the planning credits on Odyssey and is the first not to receive a credit such as lead or sub-lead. In other words, he is of a sufficient seniority that a step up to directing or coordinating a 2D Donkey Kong is very plausible, and given that he is apparently very comfortable working with Western studios, he would not be limited to just the Western studios, but he would have access to them. Of course, a mark against the possibility of his involvement here is that he has obviously been heavily involved quite recently in Donkey Kong Bonanza, although presumably level design was completed some time before the game was actually finalized. I don't think he will have been grinding away on a 2D Donkey Kong all the while, but I do think it's quite believable that he could be tasked to set up his own team involving potentially Nintendo Software Technology, Next Level Games, or Retro Studios. One more possibility. What if a transition project is a much smaller affair? Plus games are proving an effective way to rejuvenate old classics of the Switch era and give them a new lease of life on Switch 2, and with the new attention paid to Donkey Kong through Donkey Kong Bonanza, it stands to reason that a Plus game would give a quick fix for some additional Kong action. If Forgotten Land can have a $20 DLC, why not Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze? This would be a perfect opportunity for Retro to work with a new team, either in Austin or at another studio, to make for a strong handover. It wouldn't even need to be the same kind of thing as Tropical Freeze. Look how Bowser's Fury was markedly different from 3D World, and yet still did very well indeed. If they wanted one vast Metroidvania Kong level or a 2D player co-op version of the game, there's plenty of scope for them to do this, and it would be a great smaller project to get the new team's feet under the table, or to refamiliarize Retro with what Donkey Kong Country always was. Okay, this is a forecast channel, so let's get down to some forecasting. Will we see a 2D Donkey Kong release by the end of 2028? I would say 70% yes, even if it is a Plus title, as I really think they want to push 2D Donkey Kong. As for Retro, I still think there's a 50% chance that Retro will be back in at least some capacity on the next Donkey Kong Country title, even if it's just supporting in the manner that Next Level Games and a handful of other people supporting on Metroid Prime 4 have done. I'd also like to say that there's a 70% chance that if there is a new Donkey Kong Country game, that it has developers from outside Japan, such as Next Level Games or Nintendo Software Technology involved. Further, I think there's a 50% chance that Toshiko Okamoto will be credited on another Donkey Kong game by the end of 2028, and if he is, it'll probably be in quite a senior role. Your mileage may vary, and if you want to make the compelling case for Mages or Intelligent Systems or Camelot Software planning to go bananas over Donkey Kong, do sound off in the comments below, and shout out to regular commenter Travel of the Stars, who has been waiting on this video for months. Thanks to the channel's Patreon members. Please follow the links below for more, but in any event, thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.